This presentation was something I originally devised as an informal talk to be given with a couple of friends. And the reaction that I got to it was so positive that I decided to expand on it, rewrite it slightly, add some more examples, explain a few things more clearly. And the title of it, the way the title is written, certainly should give you an idea of how informal it was originally intended to be. How to make not-crummy cover art for self-published work. So my intention here was to simply share some of the things that I had learned along the way about self-publishing and design for self-publishing. Because one of the things I've learned is that many people who want to self-publish are not always clear on how good design can work. And they find it very intimidating, so they go and they hire somebody. But the truth of it is that if you sit down and look at how good design works, there are a few basic, relatively easy to grasp concepts that I think can be given within the course of a single hour or so. So that's what this lecture is all about. When I started self-publishing, one of the first rules that I set for myself was I want to produce something that looks professional. I want to produce something that looks like if I took it in the bookstore and put it on the shelf next to other professionally published books, it wouldn't look hopelessly inferior. At the very least, it would look halfway competitive with the other things that were sitting there on the shelf. It might not have the same production values as a lot of other books in the marketplace, like sprayed edges and so forth, but at least I wanted the design to look reasonably professional. So a lot of what you're seeing here is the product of many generations of iteration, of tossing and testing, of trying stuff and throwing it out, until I finally settled on a design language, on a set of design metaphors, on an approach that I felt made my work look professional. And I want to share some of the ideas and discoveries that I made on the way to that destination. Now, the way I see it, there are a few common pitfalls for design in self-published work. And one of the first that I've noticed in a lot of self-published work is what I would describe as bad or incoherent messaging. There is no sense of what the book is supposed to be about. There's just an image, which doesn't really feel like it's directly connected to anything. It could just be some random piece of stock art that doesn't feel very evocative. There's a title. There's some relatively indifferent typography, and that's about it. There's no sense that any effort was really made. And the biggest way that this falls down is that we have no sense of what the book feels like or what it's about. The other thing I've noticed is, and I just touched on this 2 seconds ago, a lot of the imagery that is chosen just feels very slapdash. There's a lot of things that feel like they were just pulled out of some stock art collection without any real regard as to what kind of evocation they would have in the reader or whether they've reflected precisely enough what the book was about, that kind of thing. Another thing I saw often was what I would describe as bad concept, bad execution. And that's basically when you have failure on both sides of this equation. You have something that not only looks bad, but was clearly not conceived with any degree of coherence. We don't really have any sense of what this was supposed to convey or why. And the flip side of that is when there's a good concept, when there's clearly some thought and imagination going on about how to present things, about how to get us aware of what this book is and what it's all about, but it's not executed well. Maybe the typefaces are badly chosen, maybe the art is uninspired. Again, there's a sense that this could be better if they had only tried a little harder. And then another problem I see often is when it's a poor use of the medium, whether it's analog or digital, in the sense that we have something that is a printed artifact, but there is not really much use of the fact that it's a printed artifact. It's put together, again, with an indifference as to whether or not it was something in print or in digital. And for a digital artifact, again, there's this sense of not having paid attention to the fact that this is generally going to be rendered at the size of about a postage stamp on a phone screen. And these are all tricky things. They're hard to get right, and they're mistakes that people can make without realizing them. The first mission you should set for yourself when you are putting together a book is to have proper communication of intention. Your book cover should communicate what your book is about and how it is about it. And a lot of this revolves around leveraging things that may already be extant in our visual culture. You want to leverage things like how a typeface can evoke a certain sense for what a book is about, or your choice of imagery. I'm going to step through some examples here. So when you create a cover, you're trying to communicate information about what's between the covers of the book. Generally, you want to communicate the title and the author. Those are the most basic pieces of information that we need about a book. Optionally, we communicate some information about the author, like for instance, from the creator of. Optionally, we communicate some promotional details, perhaps a blurb. But the most important thing that we need to communicate is some sense of what the experience of reading the book will be like. And this can be highly subjective. It's not always the easiest thing in the world to get across. But if you're familiar with the way other books do this, then your job becomes a lot easier. One very common mistake that can be made here is when you are using the design language that is reserved for one kind of book, for one kind of experience with reading a book. When you take that design language and you apply it to another book where it doesn't apply. In this case, we have George Orwell's 1984. The problem is that we're using a typeface and some stock art that give the impression that it is a very, very different kind of book. It just doesn't mesh. Even if we know only a very few things about the book, this will become glaringly obvious to us. Now, there is one tremendous exception to this rule, which is if you are trying to leverage the clash between the design language that you are using and the material as part of what you're trying to convey. And so this is an example right here, my big fat surveillance state wedding. But this sort of thing is really tricky, really hard to get right, so I don't recommend trying to do it at least at first. It takes some warming up to get to, but you can do it with some practice. Now, to give you an idea on how other designs for George Orwell's 1984 have come and gone over the years, I've chosen 3 of my favorites here. And I want to talk a little bit about why I think they work for the book in question. A lot of times when you do a cover for 1984, there's usually like a camera or an eyeball or something along those lines. You know, Big Brother's watching you. But I like it when they are able to step a little bit away from that without completely compromising the flavor of what the book is about. So on the left-hand side, we have a painting by Francis Bacon, who's a fairly important British painter. He had a lot of artwork that was highly disturbing. And I like the choice of this one as a cover design because it communicates to the reader the flavor of how the book's story deals in things like the depersonalization of a human being. And in the middle, we have another painting. I don't remember where this is from, but it also provides a sense of the book's flavor in terms of how it is largely about bureaucracy and the immutability of the state, about how everything has to run on a timetable, everything is in its orderly place, and so on and so forth. Very much the culture of what a modern office is like, to be honest about it. And on the right-hand side, this was a design I think that was produced in the 1970s, and you don't really see designs of this particular flavor very much anymore. This is an example of a design that is dated a little bit, but I actually like it quite a bit because it's bold. There's that high contrast photography. There's those strong splashes of color. There's a strong typeface. And the image itself brings to mind a lot of the things that we would associate with the book without being hopelessly cliched. You know, the guy with the bullhorn, that's actually a pretty good way to communicate many of the same things without relying on the eyeball or the camera or all of the other cliched imagery that tends to revolve around this book. So an important thing that you want to do when you're putting together your book cover portfolio is to maintain a big bank of sources of imagery and inspiration. You want to keep a store of images that catch your eye and that stimulate further ideas about how your designs can work. An important part of this is to get in the habit of collecting and keeping images that excite you. You want to collect them as early as you can and as often as you can. You want to get into the habit of going out and looking for things that are interesting. Because not everything you collect is necessarily going to be part of a design. Some of this stuff can just be stimulus for other ideas. You might see an existing book cover and say to yourself, oh, that general way that things are laid out, I like that. I want to do that. I want to see how that would work for this thing that I'm thinking of. So you use all these things to find out, on top of just getting inspiration for projects, is to also get a sense of your own taste, to find out what kinds of things you like to see and why. It's very important to cultivate a sense of your own tastes because that gives you a starting point. You can say, I like this because, I like that because, and you can build on that. And you can use that also as a starting point and an end point, because then you can go back and look at designs you've made before and revisit them and rethink them. You can look back at some of the images you've collected and you can say, how have my feelings about all of these changed in the past year or two? Maybe I think very differently about this now. Maybe the things that I thought were attractive are now just simply gaudy, now that I've had a chance to see some other things at work. Here are 3 images that I've pulled more or less at random out of the massive clip art collection that I have on my computer. I like all of them. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to use all of them, But I like them because each one of them stimulates, for me, a different set of ideas. The rainbow on the left, for instance, might be really useful as an underlay for something. The picture in the middle and the picture in the right are both things that I would use as central parts of a design because they're striking and because they both convey very different flavors. So there isn't necessarily any one thing about an image that I may find worthwhile, that I may find as a reason to keep it. If an image has multiple reasons for me to want to hang on to it, then that's even better. But even one thing is always a good reason to keep it. One very nice thing about doing all this work in the modern age is that free art, free to use, free to collect, free to repurpose, is easier to find than ever. There are services all over the place for doing this sort of thing. Pexels, Unsplash, ArtV, Pixabay. Those are just 4 off the top of my head, all of which I've used at one point or another. And one very nice thing about them is they tend to have relatively liberal licensing arrangements. When you take an image from them, there are relatively few restrictions on what you can do with it. That said, you always want to get familiar with what those restrictions are. For instance, with Unsplash, one of the things you cannot do with your images is create a competing image service of the same kind. And you are also forbidden from reusing those images as is on a product. There has to be some kind of transformative effect. You can't just take it and slap it on a t-shirt, for instance. They don't let you do that. Museum websites are another place I found are a really good source of inspiration, especially since the vast majority of the imagery there is out of copyright and free to use. But you should always remember that there will be certain stipulations and permissions and rights controls associated with many of those images. So do the homework and find out what your repurposing can be like. You must never assume that an image with no apparent owner, with no apparent information about it, is just free to use. This is a great way to create a terrible trap for yourself further down the line. The next big thing that you must do is learn the lessons that other designs have to teach you, because there are tons of them. You want to look at the way existing books in existing categories that you're familiar with, or even ones you're not so familiar with, you want to look at the way they work, how they convey their messages, how they bring the whole package together, and keep notes on them. The more of these that you bring together into a study portfolio, the more examples you'll have to draw on to think about how your own work can be professional in the same way. And again, you want to get a little bit out of your bubble if you can do it. Like if you're primarily doing stuff in fiction, you want to look at some nonfiction titles too, because there's some wonderfully creative work going on there. One reason you may want to study how publishers pull the whole package together is to get a sense of how you can create consistency across a brand. And this is something I've been pretty aggressive about in my own work. You'll notice I always have the logo in a certain place. There's the consistency of typeface. There's the consistency of certain aspects of the presentation. I'm not saying that you have to do this, but I am saying that if you do this, it will provide a certain degree of unity across the product line that you're creating. If you want to be a little more loose about it, that's fine too, but it's always worthwhile to see what kind of message it sends to have a unified product line, especially if you're doing something in a series or if you're doing something, a whole bunch of things that have a similar set of concerns. Here are 3 publishers that are worth studying for the sake of a high degree of consistency across their branding. The one on the left is the Oxford World's Classics. And the way they work is they have this band near the bottom where there's the text, and the remainder of the cover, including the top and the margin at the bottom, will have some nice striking imagery. And there's a consistency of typeface. There is usually a single blurb sentence of some kind of descriptive text aside from the title and the author. The center is an example of the cover art that is used by NYRB, New York Review Books, one of my favorite publishers. And the way they work is they're actually doing something that I thought it was a bit of a rule breaker the more I looked at it. They'll take an image, and then they'll have a cartouche with the text in it, usually in a nice, consistent typeface. The same typeface is used consistently across their covers, with pleasantly contrasting color schemes. But they will always stick this cartouche directly in the middle. And normally, you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to cover up your imagery. But what they will often do is position the artwork in such a way that the edges and the big margin at the bottom will contain enough visual information about whatever it is that they're showing that you won't mind. The contrast will feel pleasant instead of jarring. And then on the right-hand side, we have the Penguin Classics. I can't think of any other publisher that has been more ferociously consistent in their designs over the years. And they've tweaked them as we've gone on. This particular cover, for instance, is from just before they recently refreshed the design work that they use in the US editions of their books. I'm going to talk about the UK editions of their books separately because they're radically dissimilar. But they generally work the same way. There's the band with the Penguin Classics logo. There's the text below. There's the author in one typeface. There's the title in another typeface. And then there's that nice big splash image across the top with nothing in front of it. Very nice, clean, basic, consistent approach. Now, even when you have a design that is as ferociously consistent as the Penguin design, there are still bits of fun that you can have with it. So the one on the left is pretty typical. It's a good example of how they do 99% of their books. But the one in the center is an example of how they can change things up just a little bit, where you have the hand reaching in to steal the Penguin Classics logo. And on the right, which, by the way, is an example of the slightly refreshed version of the Penguin Classics look, we have the artwork actually intruding into that space. And we have this nice, manga-ish cover art that is, a little bit more modern, a little bit more spunky than we would expect from Penguin, who generally tend to rely on things like, classical paintings. So even when you have a design this deliberately consistent across volumes in a brand, you can still do fun things with it. There's nothing stopping you. It's a base on which you can build. Most of us, I think, are familiar with the way that certain classic books have a certain classic piece of imagery associated with them. My favorite example is The Great Gatsby, the painting that has appeared in its original printing and that has appeared in printings ever since. That's the kind of thing you really don't want to mess with. Once you have a design like that is iconic and that speaks for the book across the years, you don't want to touch it. Now, most of us, I don't know if any of us are ever going to be in that position, but it's worthwhile to look at the ways that people have tried to break away from that core design and tinker with it, and how those have been both successful and not. The one on the right is a design that was created for the movie tie-in version of the book, the movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio, and I kind of like it. It's got that Art Deco look, and it's got that funky typeface, and it's got the, even though it has the pyramid of heads design, which I'm not crazy about, it still looks pretty nice. But at the end of the day, I'm still going to pick the first one because it's really hard to unseat a design that is that spare and that basic and that beautiful. So even though you can change it up by trying to be more sophisticated, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get a better design. It just means you're going to get a different one. It means you're going to get one that may stand out and that may attract the attention of a new wave of audiences. But that doesn't mean that you've created something that is designed to displace something that has since emerged and taken its seat in the ages. It's very hard to do that. Here's an example of 3 takes on a cover for a modern classic, Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange. The leftmost one is the most common one that I've seen as of late. If I go into a bookstore and I look for a copy of it on the shelf, that tends to be the one that I see most often, and it's not bad. The juxtaposition between those 2 pieces of art on the cover is pretty effective. But at the end of the day, it's more serviceable than anything else. So it doesn't really stand out for me. If I was going to design this, I would probably keep the art, but rework the typefaces pretty heavily. The one in the middle is very deliberately an homage to the film version. I don't know if the artwork that they have there is a piece of stock art, if it was something that was commissioned, but it is deliberately designed to remind us of the film. And it's a nice arrangement. It's actually pretty good. But the one on the right, for me, tends to work the best because, again, it's the most direct and the most stripped down. On the other hand, it also takes the biggest risks because what they're trying to do with it is they're using a simple single image as a way to evoke in the reader some sense of what the book is about based on what we might already know about it, because the book is something of an established classic. If you're coming in cold and you don't know that one of the first things that you find out in the book is that the main character drinks milk that has drugs in it as a way to spice himself up for violence, then the picture of a glass of milk on the cover is really not going to have much significance. But if you're a certain class of reader and you're familiar with the book and you know what's going on, you're going to look at that and you're going to smile, just as I did. So using that kind of iconic in-universe imagery, I guess you could call it, it's a risk. But there are times when it's a risk worth taking. For instance, if you have an existing established audience for your work and you're trying to wink at them by way, again, of some in-universe piece of information, then you can do that. But as your first iteration of a cover out of the gate, it might not be the best idea. Here are 3 covers over the years for another modern science fiction classic, William Gibson's Neuromancer. The one on the left is the very first one that was produced when the book came out in paperback. And the digital artwork that it features on the cover was pretty groundbreaking at the time, but today I don't want to say that it's dated, but that it's become highly specific in its appeal. It's narrowed its appeal a great deal. It doesn't necessarily feel like the kind of thing that we would want to universally use in a cyberpunk story. The one in the middle is pretty daring in terms of what it's trying to do. We're using some fairly simple iconographic, minimal imagery to give a little bit of a sense of what's going on. I don't think it's completely successful, and I've seen the other reissues of Gibson's work that use the same basic design pattern as this, and I'm not really all that enamored of them. I think it's a little too simple, honestly. The one on the right, with that digital mosaic of the what looks like Kowloon City in Hong Kong, it's perfect. You get a great sense of the urban sprawl that pervades the book, and also that weird vertiginous kind of flavor, which adds to it. Also adds a flavor that is found in the book itself, which is a kind of a psychedelic effect. There's a lot of stuff in the book I could describe as synesthetic, and this cover has a really great encapsulation of those things. So I'm prejudiced. I think this is the best one of the bunch. Now we have here 3 covers that I think are good because they just take a single image, a really simple, striking image, and they build everything around it. The one on the left is a book that I've talked about on my channel before. I was attracted to it, honestly, because of the cover art, and then I found out that the subject matter was right up my alley, too, so I picked it up, and it's sitting on the shelf behind me. I love this book. And that design is also, a great example of something where you're just taking this really striking image and just zinging the viewer with it and just daring them to read the book. The same thing for the one in the middle. I didn't even know what that was at first until I looked closely and realized that was a prison block. And for a book that is about the difficulties of urban life in the 21st century, it's pretty spot on. And also, it's unusual. Most of the time when we look at a prison in a photo, we see the yard. And this is all we see here is walls and lights and those little slits that are windows. It's highly depersonalized. And that's by itself striking. And on the right, we have Max Ernst, Une Semaine de Bonté, which is a book told entirely in the form of a series of collages created from 19th century woodcuts. So again, every single page is like this. So they took one striking page from it, they put it on the cover, they kept the text out of the way, and that's all you needed to do. And again, this is something else that is common with all 3 of these, is that the text, for the most part, stays out of the way. They just stand back and let the image breathe. They just give the image room to show itself off, to do its work, and the text is made as complementary as possible. That's a really important thing. When you have a good image, don't step on it. Here we have 2 covers that use an approach that I would describe as the maximalist approach, where you are essentially just taking everything in the world and throwing it at the viewer, and you're doing it in a way that is designed to grab their attention. But you also have to balance things in such a way that they don't simply become chaos and noise. The cover on the left was created by Tadanori Yoko, who is a famous, world-renowned graphic designer. He's been working for many, many years in Japan. And this is a good example of his approach overall. He has a lot of color, he has a lot of activity, he has a lot of individual details, and he also has these wild symmetries and asymmetries throughout his work. But there is a balance to the whole thing, and that's difficult to get right, but he gets it right, and that's why this cover works for me. On the right side, we have another example of someone just sort of dumping out their clip art folder. But there's a certain amount of balance to it in the sense that the top part's dominated by the barcode, which gives it this, it anchors it in a way. And at the bottom, we have all of that stuff piling up. And in the middle, in a color that is distinct from everything else in this design, we have the title. So I think this is a bit of a jumble, but the more I've looked at this, the more I've grown fond of it. And I will say that while I don't necessarily think it's the best example to emulate, there are ideas here that are worth testing out on your own when you have something that you want to have a similarly chaotic, shambolic flavor to it. Another clever thing that I see is when a cover design is evocative of the thing that it's supposed to be talking about in an oblique way. The book on the left is about a guy who has been editing Hollywood movies for decades, and one of the most famous things that he's worked on is Star Wars. And so what they do is they use the typeface and the text in a way that is deliberately designed to evoke the Star Wars pre-crawl text sequence. The one in the middle is designed to look like the Miles Davis album Kind of Blue itself, down to the typography, the choices of colors, the monochrome photography, and so on and so forth. And on the right, Understanding Comics, which, by the way, I can't recommend enough just as a general guide to understanding how comics work as a medium. We have another very simple, very boiled down line art image. This is much more successful for me than the Neuromancer cover that we saw earlier. So it's a book about comics, and it's using the design language of comics itself right on the cover to convey what it's all about. Now, the vast majority of us are probably going to be publishing digitally first and with print as a secondary medium. Although there are a fair number of people who are discovering that when they speak directly to a small audience, that audience likes to have physical artifacts. So one way or another, you're going to have to think about print and digital as complementary media. You're going to have to think about how to design for both of them. So the designs you come up with need to be able to be friendly to the demands that each of those media have, and they're very different. Here, for instance, is the album that we were just talking about a couple of slides back, Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. The picture on the left is what the LP cover looked like. That's a 12-inch by 12-inch piece of artwork. And on the right, there's an example of how the artwork was re-rendered for a CD reissue. You'll notice that one of the things they've done is they've eliminated some of the details. They've changed the proportions of the font slightly. Like, for instance, the list of personnel, it's actually slightly larger, proportionately speaking, on the CD cover than it is on the album cover, because otherwise it would just disappear. Those kinds of things are very common and have been very common for quite some time. They will take the artwork that was designed for the LP cover, and then when a CD reissue was in the works, they would say, okay, how can we blow this down to something that's only 12 centimeters on a side instead of only 12 inches on a side, and not have all of the important details just vanish. To give you another idea of how artwork can be reissued across form factors, I want to break out one of my favorite album covers of all time. This is from Skinny Puppy's album Vivisect 6, and it was designed by a gentleman named Stephen R. Gilmore, who used a collage of a number of different X-rays to create the image that you are seeing here. One of them was apparently his father's own head. I think it's beautiful work, and it's even more beautiful if you get the gatefold LP album version of the record. This is what the gatefold album version looks like when it's unfolded. You saw on the right-hand side, that right-hand panel is what the first picture that we saw. Now we see the full image, and it's really striking. And what's nice is that if you pick up the LP and you flip it over, you see that artwork wrapping all the way around from front to back like this. So it works when it's unfolded, and it works when it's folded. And it's beautiful. And you can also see, just how tiny the typeface is for the song titles in the LP version, because we're dealing with something that's 12 inches on a side. Now, for contrast, let's take a look at the cassette version of the artwork. This is what you would see if you took the cassette off the rack and held it in your hand. It's only a tiny, tiny subsection of the original artwork. There's some detail there, but it just doesn't have the same kind of impact. But as a compensation, if you take the sleeve out of the cassette box and you open it all the way up, you get to see the full artwork. So that's one way that you can compromise, is you can use the form factor in its compressed and expanded version to contain, a cut-down version of the original art and then something resembling your original version. But there are still a lot of changes here. The way that the song titles, for instance, have been moved completely off of the artwork onto the flap and so on and so forth. So with each form factor, you're presented with both restrictions and opportunities, and you want to be able to use both of those as they arise. Here's how I used the digital and the print editions of one of my books in different ways. And this is also reflective of the way that I tend to approach the difference between the digital and print edition in my books generally. With the print edition, you'll notice that part of the artwork wraps across the spine, as you can see on the 3D turnaround on the left. The right-hand versions is what things look like when we're just looking at the cover as we would in an ebook edition. And you'll notice that the tiny little blown down version is still striking. It still catches the eye because of the big text and because of that big splash of image. So this is something that I sweated out pretty heavily when I was putting this cover together. I originally had another design that didn't look anywhere nearly as good when it was blown down. Unfortunately, I don't have that one anymore. But I wanted something that would look good at both sizes and that would lend itself to being allowed to have interesting things done with the spine, because that's a consistent thing that I do across my books. Now, I've talked a little bit about how typefaces and legibility are important things, the way that the typefaces that are used on an LP cover will not necessarily look as good on a CD cover if they're kept at the same size. You want to keep them at the proper proportions. And this is something that is generally true in books as well, especially since the inside of the book tends to be nothing but text. But it's doubly true on the outside, because the outside of a book is often the first point of contact anyone is going to have with it. You want to make it a good impression. So you want to be legible and you want to be communicative with your fonts. And one of the things that you have to consciously remind yourself of is that more is not necessarily better. Fonts can be beautiful, they can be elaborate, they can be daring, they can be complex, and all of those things can work against you. Because again, people only have one chance to see your cover for the first time. Here's a sample fantasy book cover that I just made up with 3 different ways that we could do typeface treatments. On the left side, you'll see that the typeface at the bottom, it's in a different color, one that's a little bit more contrasty. And it also has a bit of an embossing effect. And that's a way to simulate, like for instance, the kind of thing that we would do in print when we have an embossed cover. Now, I'm fond of those kinds of things, but the printing that I'm doing, and the printing that you are almost certainly going to be doing as well, will generally not be able to support things like 3D embossing unless you're spending a ton of money. So simulating those things in print, in a 2-dimensional design, it's tempting, but the problem is that it adds visual noise. So you'll notice that one of the problems we have with that text to the left is that it can be a little bit hard to read. So in the middle, we've thrown out the embossing effect. We just kept the colors. You notice that the top, the author and the title are in contrasting colors. And this is not the worst thing that you could do. But one thing I do want to encourage you to experiment with is to start with as basic a set of colors as you can get away with. And that's what I've done on the right here. I've just gone with straight white because the image in the background is dark enough that the contrast will stand out naturally. And if it didn't, we can tweak that. I'll talk about that in the next slide. And we really haven't lost anything. We still have the same basic idea. We still have the same basic flavor. We've removed a lot of the noise though, and that's really important. Again, we might even go so far as to simplify the typeface that we used for the title. This is all a reflection of something that was expressed to me in the writing of a graphic designer whose work I respect enormously, a man named Milton Glaser. And one of the little things that he came up with along the way was just enough is more. He prefaced that with less is not necessarily more. But you want to find a good balance between when things are getting a little bit too sophisticated for their own good and when they can be sophisticated for the sake of sending a message. This leads me to talk about one of the things that I see often, which is people using things like bolded edges of a typeface to get it to stand out against a busy background. Now, this is workable, but it isn't really the best way to go because, again, it adds noise. It adds more information that the eye has to process in order to be able to make sense of the text. And you don't want to do that. Your reader is going to see your cover only once for the first time, and you want to make that as clean an impression as possible. So on the left, we have the version where the text has been outlined, but on the right, I've done something a little different. I've removed the outline, but I've dropped a little bit of a diffuse shadow, and it's just near where the text is. It's not across the whole image. It's very subtle. And one nice thing about this is that, again, it cuts down on the amount of noise that we have to present to the reader to make things theoretically more legible. So for me, this is a much more efficient way to do this. Another approach would be to do what we did with, for instance, the New York Review Books covers, which is put the text in a cartouche and give it a solid color background and be done with it. But this is a very valid approach worth experimenting with also. I guess this would be a good way to segue into the next bit of discussion, which is about how to draw attention in a cover, how to find the focus of your design. People talk about things like focus and balance and so on and so forth. And the main reason that you want to have a sense of this is to be able to guide the eye directly to the things that are most important in the picture. The maximalist covers that we talked about before, they invite the eye to slide all over the place, but at the same time, there's a few pieces in it that are strongly anchored, like the title or the publisher icon. So here's some examples of how drawing attention can be made, even for things that seem relatively simple. Here are 2 pieces of stock art that I pulled out of my collection more or less at random. I like both of them. I don't know that I would use either of them for any one thing that I would do, but I like both of them and I think they're good teaching examples. So if we were going to use these in a cover, here's a couple of ways that we could do this. With the image on the left, we want to follow a dictum that I talked about earlier, which is don't get in the way of things. We take our text, we put it down below the woman's face. Even though the woman's face is obscured by that brush of red, it's still what our eye is going to be drawn to a high degree. We want to look at faces, especially when that one eye is still exposed. So we obey that. We let that do its magic. We let that do its work. And then we put the text down from that, and we let the text draw the eye separately from the images. And on the right-hand side, all we're really doing there is just cropping away anything that doesn't need to be there. And again, we're trying to stay out of the way of the parts of the image that do most of the work. The eye is out of focus, but it is still drawing our attention, especially since it is right next to the gun barrel, which is right up in our faces. Here's an exercise in figuring out how to take a raw image and make the most effective use of it. I have here a painting that I like very much. It's by Giovanni Boldini. And the young boy that you see in this painting, by the way, is the very young Winston Churchill. Now, there's a couple of ways that we could work with this image. The first would be to just trim some of the extraneous edges of the image and put our text at the bottom. And that's not a bad way to do it. But I'm not really crazy about it because it's kind of bland in its symmetry. It's very up and down. It's very side to side. It doesn't really catch the eye, except in the sense that there's that nice image at the top doing the work. But we can do a little bit better. With the one on the right, we've cropped things even more fiercely. And we use the negative space at the top left to put our text in, to anchor everything else. So we've still got all the parts of the image that are really drawing the eye. The woman, the boy, their clothing. And then we have the text next to it, complementing it, offsetting it, instead of fighting for space or attention with it. A trick I see often these days in both book covers and movie posters is the use of text over an image with some degree of transparency on the text. And while I like this, I don't necessarily think it's always the best way to go because it's difficult to get right and it's starting to approach becoming a cliche on its own. There are other ways that we can do this. Like with the image on the left, this is one that I created. We've got this negative space that's given to us at right by strategically cropping what was originally a larger image, and we can stick our text in there and make it go straight up and down, but without getting boring because it's offset on the left side of the whole cover by that nice splashy image. Now, if we do choose to use text on top of everything, for one, we have to choose our image carefully. And two, we have to make sure that there's enough contrasts between the image and the way the text itself is presented that it doesn't feel like a jumble. One very clever thing that these guys did with this cover for Bright Lights Big City is the way they varied the translucency of each of the letters to make it feel like we're looking at the glittering city lights, which I think is actually quite clever. I like that. It's better than the usual kind of thing where you just take a consistent level of transparency and stick all the text on top of it at that level. But I would say that on the whole, this is the kind of thing that you want to avoid, if only, again, because it's becoming a cliche. It's really hard to do well. You need the right typefaces for it. It's an advanced exercise. You can always try it if you want to, but do remember that it is not necessarily the best way to make use of the whole page. That when you're making use of the whole page, you can make use of the whole page by way of a balance between block elements like what we have left. As you may have guessed, a lot of the designs that you're seeing from me here were the result of a lot of tossing and testing, a lot of experimenting. There were a lot of failures. For any one book cover that you've seen that I did, there's probably 30 or 40 that didn't make the cut. So iterating and experimenting are super important. You always want to keep trying. You never know what is going to stick. And I have a great example of this from a cover that was almost completely redesigned. When I did my big rebranding a few years ago as Infinimata, I redesigned all of my books from the ground up. And one of the ones that I found hardest to get right was Summerworld, because I just could not figure out how to properly convey the flavor of what I wanted in the story. I wanted some kind of doorway or portal effect or something like that. And so I had this one image of this kind of Taoist doorway and this cityscape. And I tried a few different arrangements of them, but they just all looked really haphazard and trashy. And I was very unhappy with it. So I put it away and tried to forget about it. So when I came back to it about a week later, I found myself experimenting with very hard-edged cuts between the images, basically taking something and slicing it in a way that looked like it was cut from a piece of paper and then pasting it over it. And I tried that a couple of different ways. I tried one with a much softer edge to it to see how that came out. But I said, this still isn't working. And for me, the biggest problem was the portal image no longer seemed to convey what I wanted it to convey. It just felt like something that was from the wrong book. So I said, let's throw that out and start all over again. But let's keep the cityscape, because the contrast between the city and something else more fantastic is something I really want to keep. So as luck would have it, I blundered across another image that had a wonderfully fantastic flavor to it. And I said, let's make that our primary image. And let's make the city a secondary image. And let's use a round cutout, and we'll arrange the text and the icon on top of that. And we have the lantern at the bottom taking up the middle space and anchoring and balancing other things. So what's striking here is that what I ended up with really didn't have much of anything to do with my original designs, but I could not have gotten there without making those original failed designs and saying to myself, okay, here's what's not going to work. Now, I touched earlier on how formatting for print and formatting for digital are inherently different things, and I want to talk briefly about that, although any competent discussion of formatting for print is really going to be its own lesson. But there are a few things that I want to touch on as an adjunct to everything else that we've been talking about. When you create something for print, the margins of the design, as shown here in red, are going to most likely not show up, and you want to be very conscious of that when you make your design. For instance, look at where I have the Infinimata logo positioned at the top right. It's not positioned proportionate to the absolute top right of the image. It's positioned proportionate to the top right of the trim. And that goes for every other visual element that we have in that cover. You always want to make sure that when you're designing for print, you're keeping your trim in mind. You will have to account for it, not the printers. And if you've come up with a design that does not respect that, it's going to look very awkward when you finally do get your proof copy. Now, I've barely touched on a lot of the really important parts of this craft. And the next step that I can encourage for you, aside from making your own covers and evaluating them and trying to do this over and over again, is to do some more reading. I've got a number of books here that I can recommend. Simon Garfield's Just My Type is a great book on typography and typefaces, on how to use them well. Stephen Heller's Design Literacy is exactly what it sounds like. It's a way to get an understanding of how design is meant to work and what it means to educate ourselves in the understanding of how design functions. Peter Mendelssohn is a graphic artist who's done a great many award-winning book covers, and he has a book that is simply called Cover, that is an anthology of a lot of his best work and some discussions of how and why he created them the way he did. So that's another nice living example of how these things work. An author named Andrew Haslam has some very good books on book design. The problem is they're currently out of print, so you may have to do some research to find them, but I do recommend them. I mentioned Milton Glaser before. He's a very important graphic designer. He's the one who created the I Love New York logo, for instance. And he has another book called Art is Work. Again, kind of on the pricey side, kind of hard to find, well worth it, because he goes into a lot of how thinking about design is something you have to train yourself for. And there's also Edward Tufte's books on the presentation of visual information. These are classics. I don't know of any graphic designer who doesn't have copies of these, because they show you how information can be presented to a viewer in a number of different ways that is exciting and original and informative without compromising the fact that they're interesting to look at. And finally, there's a book that I've talked about before on my channel called Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. And the more I think about it, the more I realize books are very much everyday things that we have to live with, in the same way that a tea kettle is, or a door. And so many of the things that he says about how we need to think about something that we interact with literally every single day, I think those lessons are doubly valuable here when we talk about something that we interact with, because we want to interact with them, because they're supposed to be enjoyable to interact with. So the last point that I want to make with all of this is you are going to get the best results by trying and failing. You're going to get the best results by trying to make things not necessarily in imitation of the best, but with inspiration from the best. You want to look to what's out there that seems successful to you, that seems striking, and that isn't necessarily striking or successful because it's splashy or gaudy, but because it tries to do one thing and do it really well. Those I find are some of the best examples to draw from, because they're also the easiest to draw from, the easiest to build from. They don't require you to go and get a tremendously expensive and complicated typeface and then try to figure out how to lay that out on top of a really gaudy piece of artwork. Start with the simple things and build upwards from there. And don't ever stop iterating. That to me is the biggest thing. Always keep trying to make new things. Always keep trying to surpass yourself. Don't compare yourself to anyone but yourself. Thanks very much.